The room was silent, except for the sound of a single monitor beeping in the corner. James lay in the hospital bed, his skin pale, his breath uneven. The doctors had spoken the words no one ever wants to hear. You have only 1 month left to live. 30 days. That was all. No cure, no second chances, no way back. The news spread through his family like wildfire. His wife collapsed into tears, his children clung to each other, and his friends stood frozen, unable to accept what they had just heard. For James, the world suddenly felt smaller, darker, as if the walls of time were closing in on him. Every second now mattered. Every minute felt heavier. Every day became a countdown. And yet, as those days began to pass, something extraordinary started to unfold. Doctors expected him to weaken rapidly, to slip away quietly, as most patients in his condition did. But James did not. He held on. He pushed forward. He fought with a strength no one could explain. The doctors were puzzled. The medical chart said one thing, but James's spirit said another. His body should have been giving up. Instead, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he seemed almost stronger than before. This was no ordinary case. This was the beginning of a story that would leave even the most experienced doctors speechless. Because against all odds, James's story was about to take a turn no one could predict. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you believe in hope, if you believe that miracles still exist in this world, then make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. It may seem small, but your support allows us to keep telling these stories of survival, courage, and the impossible becoming real. Now, let's return to James. Day 1. He refused to stay in bed. With trembling legs, he forced himself to stand. The nurses rushed to stop him, afraid his fragile body would collapse. But James whispered, "I don't want to die lying down. Not yet." Day 5. His appetite should have been gone. Instead, he asked for food. Small portions, yes, but enough to surprise everyone around him. He smiled faintly and said, "If I only have a month, I want to taste life until the end." Day 10. His friends visited, prepared to say their goodbyes. But instead of sorrow, they found James laughing at old stories, telling jokes, even comforting them. He said, "Don't cry for me. Cry for the ones who never had the chance to fight." Each passing day was supposed to bring him closer to death. But strangely, it felt like each passing day made him more alive. By day 15, something unusual happened. His blood work, which should have been declining fast, showed a small, almost insignificant improvement. The doctors brushed it off as an anomaly. They said, "It won't last." But deep down, they were unsettled. By day 20, James was walking the hospital halls, slowly, weakly, but walking nonetheless. Other patients whispered as he passed. Some called him the man who refused to die. The staff grew divided. Some believed his body was simply delaying the inevitable. Others began to wonder, could something extraordinary be happening inside him? And then came day 30, the day James was supposed to die. His family gathered around the bed, holding his hands, preparing for the worst. The doctors monitored closely, ready for the moment his heart would stop. But instead of fading away, James opened his eyes wide, sat up, and whispered, "I'm still here." The room fell silent. Doctors exchanged nervous looks. Nurses gasped. His wife clutched his hand tighter. Her tears of grief transformed into tears of hope. 30 days had passed. The deadline was over. James was alive. And that was only the beginning.
Because what happened in the days and weeks that followed would challenge science, defy logic, and leave even the most experienced doctors asking the same question: how do you explain a miracle?
James was not a celebrity. He was not a famous athlete or a wealthy businessman. He was an ordinary man who lived an ordinary life. And yet, in that simplicity, he carried something extraordinary within him. He was 42 years old, a school teacher who had spent his life shaping young minds. In the classroom, he was more than a teacher. He was a mentor, a guide, and sometimes even a father figure to those who needed one. His students admired him for his humor, his patience, and his ability to make the most difficult lessons feel like stories worth remembering. Outside of school, James was a devoted husband and father of two. His daughter, Emily, was only 9 years old, with big brown eyes that reflected innocence and curiosity. His son Daniel was 13, quiet but observant, already carrying the weight of maturity that no child should bear. To them, James was not just a parent, he was a hero, the steady hand they could always hold on to. For years, James ignored the small warnings his body gave him. The fatigue that came too quickly, the cough that lingered too long, the nights when he felt weaker than he should. He always dismissed them with the same words: "It is nothing, I am fine." But behind the smile, behind the jokes, the truth was that something was quietly growing inside him. That truth came crashing down one afternoon in the middle of class. James had been explaining a history lesson when his vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the desk, but before anyone could react, he collapsed to the floor. His students screamed, and the school nurse rushed in. Minutes later, he was on a stretcher, heading to the hospital. The tests revealed the devastating news: an aggressive form of cancer. It had already spread beyond control. Surgery was impossible. Treatment would do little more than slow the inevitable. The doctor, with a heavy voice, gave the verdict: 1 month, maybe less. For James, time suddenly became both precious and cruel. 1 month to say goodbye. 1 month to leave behind every word, every memory, every smile his family would need to hold on to. His wife, Sarah, tried to be strong, but every night she cried silently, hiding her face so James would not see. His children asked questions she could not answer. How do you explain to a child that their father's days are numbered? And yet, James chose not to drown in despair. He began to write letters to his children, dozens of them. Letters filled with advice, encouragement, and love. Letters meant for future birthdays, graduations, weddings, and moments he feared he would never see. Each word was a promise that even if he was gone, his voice would still guide them. He wrote for hours, his body weak, but his hand steady, refusing to give in. To Emily, he wrote, "Always be kind, even when the world is not kind to you." To Daniel, he wrote, "Never forget that strength is not measured by how much you can lift, but by how much you can carry for others." These letters became his legacy, a way to live beyond the 30 days he had been given. But something began to happen as he wrote. Instead of growing weaker, James seemed to grow stronger. His family noticed the spark in his eyes, the determination in his voice. Even the doctors could not ignore the strange resilience of a man whose body was supposed to be failing. James's case became a topic of quiet conversation among the hospital staff. Some whispered that it was sheer willpower. Others wondered if it was faith. A few dismissed it as denial. But no one could deny what they were seeing. A man who should have been fading away was instead holding on, living as if each day was not his last, but his first. The doctors prepared to watch his decline.
Instead, they found themselves watching a mystery unfold. And this was only the beginning of James's fight.
It was an ordinary day in the hospital. The sun was rising, casting pale light across the cold white walls. Nurses moved quickly through the hallways, adjusting IVs, checking charts, whispering updates to one another. For James, however, this was no ordinary day. This was the day that everything changed. 10 days had passed since the doctors delivered the crushing news. 10 days of fear, hope, and silence broken only by the sound of machines. James had tried to remain strong for his family, but inside, the weight of the diagnosis was heavier than anyone could imagine. He could not escape the thought. 30 days. That was all he had been given. On that morning, James felt weaker than usual. His chest tightened, his breath came in short bursts, and the world seemed to spin around him. A nurse entered his room, checking his vitals, and instantly noticed the irregularities. Within minutes, the medical team rushed in. Something was happening, something unexpected. James was slipping into crisis. His heart rate spiked, his oxygen levels plummeted, and panic filled the room. Doctors shouted orders, nurses rushed to stabilize him, and his wife held her breath outside the door. The memory of his collapse in the classroom replayed in her mind, like a nightmare that refused to end. Tests were run urgently. The results came back with devastating clarity. The cancer had not only spread, it had invaded areas they had not seen before. The disease was aggressive, merciless, and unstoppable. What little hope the family held on to shattered under the weight of this new revelation. The doctor, with a heavy sigh, gathered James's family together. "It has progressed faster than we anticipated," he explained. "We will do what we can to make him comfortable, but you should prepare yourselves. The time he has left may be even shorter than we thought." Silence fell over the room. His children stared in disbelief. His wife shook her head, tears streaming down her face. How could life be so cruel? How could time, already so short, be stolen even further? For James, lying in his hospital bed, the words echoed in his mind. Prepare for the end. Prepare to let go. But something inside him refused to listen. He was not ready. He would not surrender. That night, as the hospital grew quiet, James whispered a promise to himself. "I will not go like this. Not today, not tomorrow, not yet." His voice was weak, but his spirit was louder than ever. The following morning, instead of resigning himself to the inevitable, James asked the nurse to bring him a notebook. His hands trembled as he opened the first page, but his heart was steady. He began to write again, pouring every ounce of his soul onto the paper. Letters for his children, memories for his wife, words meant to last beyond his final breath. But the act of writing became more than preparation for death. It became a declaration of life. Each word was fuel, each page a battle won. The nurses noticed. The doctors noticed. Even as his scans grew worse, James grew stronger in spirit. His determination was no longer just a coping mechanism. It was something extraordinary, something that science could not measure. This was the turning point. The moment when James's story stopped being about how he would die and started becoming about how he might live. His case began to attract quiet attention. One doctor, reviewing his chart late at night, frowned at the inconsistency. He muttered, "His body should not be holding up like this." Another doctor, curious, suggested running the tests again. The results were the same, grim on paper, but inconsistent with the man lying in the bed, still holding on. Family members and friends began to notice the shift. When they visited, they no longer found a man waiting to die. They found a man fighting with every breath.
A man who somehow managed to laugh, smile, and comfort others despite his own pain. His daughter sat by his side one evening and whispered, "Daddy, are you really going to leave us?" James looked at her, his eyes filled with both sorrow and strength, and said, "Not if I can help it." In that moment, something changed. His family began to believe again. His wife, though still afraid, began to see glimmers of hope. His children, though still young, began to realize that their father was not ready to say goodbye. For the doctors, the situation was still hopeless. The scans, the numbers, the progression of the disease all pointed to the same outcome. And yet none of them could deny what they were witnessing. A man who should have been fading was somehow defying the very countdown placed upon him. This was the moment the impossible began to take shape. The moment when James's story crossed the line between expectation and mystery. The turning point was here, and it was only the beginning of something far greater than anyone could have imagined.
Hospitals are places of science. Every decision is guided by numbers, scans, and reports. But in James's case, those numbers began to tell a story that simply did not match the man who lay before them. On paper, he should have been fading. His blood counts were dropping, his organs were under strain, and the cancer had spread further than anyone realized. Every indicator screamed decline. And yet, when the doctors entered his room, they were met with a man who still had strength in his voice, a man who still managed to smile and sometimes even laugh. It became the talk of the hospital, at first only in whispers. Nurses compared notes in break rooms. "His results don't match his behavior," one said. Another shook her head. "I've never seen anything like it." Even the doctors, careful not to spread false hope, found themselves questioning what they were seeing. Day after day, James defied expectations. Small signs at first. His appetite returned, his sleep improved. The sharp pain that should have kept him immobile seemed to lessen. Each morning, instead of finding a weaker man, the staff found a fighter who looked determined to outlast the clock that had been set against him. But the mystery grew deeper. His scans, while still severe, began to reveal strange irregularities. Spots that had been visible before seemed to shrink. New growth slowed. His body, against all logic, was resisting in ways no one could explain. Doctors gathered in hushed meetings, reviewing the data. Some suggested errors in the tests. Others wondered if James was responding to something in his treatment, though technically he was only on palliative care, not curative therapy. None of the answers fit. The science they trusted so completely had no explanation. But James, however, did not dwell on the mystery. He only lived it. He spent his days talking to his children, writing letters, and sharing laughter with his wife. To him, every moment was a gift. Every breath borrowed time. He did not ask why he was still here. He only thanked God that he was. But for those who watched him, the question became impossible to ignore. Why was James still alive? How could a man so close to death seem so full of life? One night, a young resident stayed behind after his shift, standing silently in James's room. He studied the man sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in rhythm. Finally, he whispered to a nurse, "I don't understand. By every measure, he shouldn't be here." The nurse, her eyes filled with quiet awe, replied, "Some things you just can't explain." The mystery deepened further when his condition seemed to plateau. Instead of rapid decline, he stabilized. The countdown that once had been so certain now felt blurred, uncertain, and strangely flexible. Even James's family noticed. His daughter asked him one evening, "Daddy, the doctor said you'd be gone by now. Why are you still here?" James smiled gently and said, "Because I still have more to do." His words unsettled the doctors, but they also inspired them. A few began to study his case more closely, documenting every detail. Was there something unique about his body? Was his immune system doing something unusual?
Or was this truly beyond explanation, something they dared not call a miracle, but secretly wondered if it was? To his family, it did not matter what the cause was. To them, James's continued presence was enough. They cherished every extra day, every unexpected sunrise. What science labeled as irregularities, they called hope. But the deeper mystery was not only in his test results. It was in the atmosphere around him. Visitors often said that when they entered his room, they felt something different. Not just sadness, not just fear, but a strange peace, as if James carried light into the darkness. His faith, his resilience, his refusal to give in seemed to radiate beyond his own body. And so the story shifted once again. No longer just about a man fighting cancer, but about a man whose very existence was now a question mark for science and an inspiration for everyone around him. Doctors were left scratching their heads, nurses found themselves inspired to keep fighting for their own patients. Strangers who heard his story began to visit simply to see the man who had outlived the impossible. The mystery was no longer a private matter between James and his doctors. It was becoming something bigger, something that stirred hearts and raised questions no chart could answer. The man who was given 1 month to live was not just surviving. He was rewriting the rules of survival. And everyone, his family, his doctors, and the world around him was desperate to know how. Weeks had passed since James was told he had only 1 month to live. By now, the doctors expected to see a man on the edge of his final breath, clinging to the last threads of life. Instead, they found something else entirely. James was still alive, and not only alive, he was changing. It began with small details that no one wanted to believe at first. His color returned. The dark circles under his eyes lightened. He walked more than expected. His voice grew stronger, less fragile. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to his family, every little change felt like a miracle. The doctors remained cautious. They warned his wife not to mistake small improvements for recovery. The cancer is still there, they said. The outcome has not changed. But deep down, even the most skeptical among them had begun to wonder. The real revelation came one morning when James returned from a scan. The doctors gathered around the results, staring in disbelief. Several of the tumors had not grown as expected. In fact, one of them had shrunk. Not by much, but enough to be undeniable. "This should not be possible," one doctor whispered. "There's no treatment. Nothing has been done that would cause this." Another shook his head, refusing to accept the evidence. "It must be an error. Run the test again." The test was run again. The results were the same. When the news reached James, he did not celebrate. Instead, he smiled calmly and said, "I told you I am not ready to go yet." For his family, those words carried more weight than any medical report. For the first time since the diagnosis, hope was not just a fragile dream. It was real, it was measurable, and it was growing. His children began to believe again. Emily, his daughter, hugged him tightly and whispered, "Daddy, maybe you will be here for my next birthday after all." Daniel, still cautious, simply sat beside him, but in his silence, his eyes betrayed a glimmer of faith. The doctors struggled to explain what they were witnessing. Some said it was an anomaly. Others insisted it was temporary, that the disease would soon return to its course. But none of them could ignore the fact that James's body was doing something they had never seen before. This was the first revelation, the first undeniable proof that James was not just surviving against the odds, he was fighting them, bending them, breaking them. His case was no longer just tragic, it was extraordinary. And at that moment, James realized something powerful. His story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had lost hope, to every patient who had been told there was no chance, to every family sitting in a hospital waiting room praying for a miracle. His fight had become a beacon. Before we continue, take a moment to support stories like this. If you believe that miracles can happen, if you believe in the strength of the human spirit, then like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us share these powerful journeys with the world. Now, back to James. In the days that followed, his improvements continued. His energy rose. His appetite returned in full. Nurses began to notice that he was no longer the fragile man they expected to carry out on a stretcher. He was walking the halls more often, sometimes even stopping to encourage other patients. One afternoon, James sat by the bedside of a man who had just received his own grim diagnosis. The patient was broken, silent, unable to lift his eyes. James leaned forward and said, "They told me I had 30 days. That was months ago. You do not have to believe their clock. Believe in your own." Word spread quickly. Other patients began visiting James's room, not out of pity, but for inspiration. He became a quiet legend within the hospital, known not as a man dying of cancer, but as a man who refused to surrender to it. For the doctors, it was humbling. They had trained for years, memorized every study, trusted every statistic. And yet here was James defying it all. The medical staff still searched for answers, but in their hearts, they knew this was something that went beyond medicine. The revelation was clear. James's story was no longer about dying. It was about living longer, stronger, and with more purpose than anyone believed possible. And this was only the first of many revelations to come.
Hope is powerful, but hope alone does not erase suffering. Just when James and his family began to breathe a little easier, believing that perhaps the worst had passed, life reminded them that miracles are rarely straightforward. It happened suddenly, in the middle of the night. James woke gasping for air, his chest burning with pain. Alarms rang from the monitors as nurses rushed in. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling, his skin cold and pale. A severe infection had taken hold, one that his weakened immune system was ill-prepared to fight. Doctors filled the room, issuing orders, adjusting medication, and struggling to stabilize him. Sarah, his wife, was pushed into the hallway, tears streaming down her face as she watched through the glass. This was not the cancer this time. This was something different, something unexpected, and just as deadly. For hours, James' life hung in the balance. His fever soared, his blood pressure plummeted, and every passing minute seemed to drag him closer to the edge. Nurses whispered to one another, "This could be it." Even the most hopeful among them began to wonder if the miracle they had witnessed was finally ending. The doctors explained the gravity of the situation to his family. "His body is too fragile to fight this off. We will do everything we can, but you should prepare yourselves. It may only be a matter of time." Sarah held her children close, trying to shield them from the harsh reality. Emily cried into her mother's arms, begging, "Don't let Daddy go." Daniel clenched his fists, silent but trembling with fear. The family had begun to hope again, and now that hope was being ripped away. Inside the room, James lay still, barely conscious. Machines surrounded him, beeping with relentless urgency. A nurse held his hand, whispering softly, trying to keep him tethered to the world. For a moment, it seemed as if the fight was over. But James was not ready to surrender. Summoning the last of his strength, he whispered through cracked lips, "I'm not done yet." The nurse, startled by the sudden spark in his voice, leaned closer. "Stay with us, James," she said. "You're stronger than this."
The night dragged on, like a battle with no end. His fever raged, but somehow, hour by hour, James held on. By morning, against all expectations, his condition stabilized. He was not well, but he was alive. The infection had not won. For the medical team, it was baffling. Patients in James's condition rarely survived such infections. His body should have collapsed under the strain. Yet here he was, exhausted, fragile, but still breathing. One doctor shook his head in disbelief. "This man refuses every rule of medicine I know." The obstacle had left scars, both physical and emotional. James was weaker than before, his body drained by the battle. But for him, it became another symbol of his determination. Every day he survived was another day stolen back from the grip of death. Sarah asked him later, tears in her eyes, "How do you keep fighting when your body has nothing left to give?" James smiled faintly and answered, "Because every breath I take is a promise to my children, and I will not break that promise." The infection marked a turning point, not because it ended the miracle, but because it deepened it. James's story was no longer just about cancer. It was about resilience, about facing not one battle, but many, and refusing to let any of them claim victory. The family, though shaken, grew stronger too. They no longer took a single moment for granted. Every laugh, every conversation, every simple act of holding hands became precious. They lived each day as if it might be the last, yet with the growing belief that it would not be. The hospital staff, once skeptical, began to speak of James differently. He was no longer just a patient. He was an example, a symbol of endurance, proof that sometimes the human spirit can achieve what medicine alone cannot. But James's journey was far from over. The infection had been beaten back, but the cancer was still there, silent and relentless. His fight was not finished, and the world had not yet seen the greatest revelation of all. For weeks, James's story had been one of struggle. The doctors gave him 1 month. He survived. The cancer spread. He fought back. An infection nearly killed him, and still he endured. Each time death came knocking, James found a way to hold on. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what came next. It started with another round of scans. The medical team expected the results to show further decline. Even after the infection, they assumed the cancer would have advanced, consuming what little strength James had left. They braced themselves for bad news, already preparing the family for the inevitable. But when the results appeared on the screen, silence filled the room. Doctors stared at the images, blinking in disbelief. Something was wrong, or so they thought. The tumors had not grown. In fact, several had shrunk. One cluster had nearly disappeared. "This cannot be real," one doctor whispered. "Check the machine. There must be an error." The tests were repeated. The results were the same. James's cancer, once untouchable, was retreating. When the doctors entered his room, their faces betrayed their shock. James noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. They hesitated, unsure how to tell a man they had condemned to death that his body was doing the impossible. Finally, one of them spoke. "James, your cancer is shrinking." His wife gasped, covering her mouth. Emily jumped into her father's arms, tears streaming down her face. Daniel, silent as always, broke into the faintest of a smile. The family had lived under the shadow of despair for so long that hope now felt almost unbelievable. James closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "I told you I wasn't ready." Word spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses who had once whispered about his case now rushed to his room to see for themselves. Other patients, hearing the story, began to ask about the man who was given a month but refused to die. His name traveled beyond the ward, becoming a source of wonder and inspiration. For the doctors, the revelation was more than surprising. It was humbling. They had no explanation, no scientific reasoning that could fully justify what they were seeing. Yes, there were rare cases of spontaneous regression in cancer, but this was different. This was more dramatic, more immediate, and happening before their very eyes. James became the subject of medical discussions. Files were pulled, charts reviewed, theories debated. Was it his immune system? His willpower? A hidden factor no one had considered? The questions grew, but the answers remained elusive. But for James, the explanation was simple. I am alive because I still have a purpose. I still have more to give. The wow moment was not only in the scans, it was in the way James lived each day afterward. He walked the halls with renewed strength, speaking to patients who had given up, reminding them that their stories were not over. He wrote more letters, not for his children alone, but for others who needed hope. And he laughed, full, genuine laughter that filled the sterile hospital halls with something rarely heard: joy. Doctors continued their treatments cautiously, still unsure how long this miracle would last, but the results only grew more astonishing. Day by day, test by test, James's condition improved. His body, once a battlefield for unstoppable disease, now showed signs of victory. The revelation left everyone asking the same question: how was this possible? Some believed it was faith. Others believed it was sheer willpower. A few still clung to science, determined to find the missing piece. But no matter the explanation, the truth was undeniable. James was alive, and he was healing. His story spread beyond the hospital, reaching news outlets and communities far away. People who had never met him prayed for him, celebrated his progress, and found strength in his survival. James, the man given a month to live, had become a symbol of something far greater than medicine alone could explain. The wow moment was not just about survival, it was about transformation of a man, a family, a hospital, and everyone who came to know his story. And as James looked into his children's eyes, stronger than he had been in months, he said softly, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." Every story of survival reaches a moment when the fight becomes unbearable. For James, that moment came when the doctors proposed something radical. They had watched his condition defy logic, his tumors shrink without explanation, his strength return against all odds. But the cancer was still inside her, a shadow waiting for its chance to rise again. If he truly wanted to push beyond the impossible, one last and dangerous step remained. The doctors approached his bed with caution. "James," one began, "there is an experimental treatment. It carries risks, serious ones. It could help, but it could also make things worse." James listened quietly, his eyes steady. He had already faced death more than once. He knew what it meant to fight and what it meant to lose. After a long pause, he simply said, "Do it. If I've been given this second chance, I will use it. I am not afraid." His wife trembled at his side. Sarah wanted to beg him not to take the risk, but she knew this was not just his fight anymore. This was about their children, about every extra day they might have together. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "Then we'll face it together." The day of the procedure arrived. James was wheeled into a room filled with machines, doctors in protective gowns, and an atmosphere heavy with tension. For hours, the medical team worked in silence, each step carefully calculated, each decision holding his fragile life in balance. Outside, his family waited, their hearts pounding with fear. The confrontation was not just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, and deeply human. James had to surrender himself completely, trusting strangers with his life, trusting that his story was not finished. His body trembled under the strain, but his spirit remained unshaken. At one point, as the monitors flickered, his heartbeat faltered. Nurses rushed forward, doctors adjusted their instruments, and Sarah, watching through the glass, gasped in terror. It felt like the moment they had all dreaded had finally here. But then, slowly, his heart stabilized. His breath steadied. Against the chaos, James fought his way back again. Hours later, the doors opened. The doctor stepped out, exhaustion written across his face. The family braced themselves for the worst. Then, with a small, tired smile, he said, "He made it." The room erupted in tears and relief. Emily clung to her mother. Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Sarah collapsed into a chair, whispering prayers of gratitude. For James, the confrontation had pushed him closer to the edge than ever before. But once again, he had returned. When he finally opened his eyes, Sarah was by his side, her face streaked with tears. He reached for her hand and whispered, "I told you, I am still here." The doctors explained that the treatment had worked better than expected. The cancer was not gone, but it had been weakened. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, there was a real path forward. Science had joined the miracle. This confrontation changed everything. James was no longer just surviving. He was fighting with new weapons, new hope, and a story that inspired everyone who heard it. Nurses who once saw him as just another patient now visited his room simply to talk, to draw strength from his courage. Other patients looked to him as proof that even the darkest prognosis could be challenged. But the confrontation also came at a cost. James was weaker, his body drained by the procedure. He faced new pain, new uncertainty, and the knowledge that the road ahead would not be easy. Yet, instead of fear, he carried determination. If I've come this far, I can go further. The climax of his story was not in the machines or in the medical reports. It was in the quiet resilience of a man who refused to let go, who faced death head-on and chose life again and again. The confrontation had been brutal, but James emerged from it not as a victim, but as a warrior. And everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something extraordinary. This was no longer just about a man with cancer. This was about the unbreakable spirit of survival.
The weeks that followed the procedure were filled with uncertainty, but also with something James had not felt in a long time: hope. For months, every sunrise had felt like a countdown. Now, each new day felt like a gift. The man who was once told he had only 30 days left was walking, laughing, and planning for the future. At first, progress was slow. His body was weak, drained from the infection and the experimental treatment. But little by little, strength returned. He walked the halls with more confidence. He ate full meals again. His laughter echoed through the corridors, a sound that lifted not only his family, but also the nurses and patients who had come to know him as more than just a name on a chart. Scans continued to show progress. The cancer, once unstoppable, now appeared to be retreating. It was not gone, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it once was. For the doctors, it was nothing short of astonishing. One of them confessed to James privately, "I do not know how to explain this. By all logic, you should not be here, but here you are." For his family, the resolution was clear. James was alive. He was not just surviving, but living. Emily and Daniel no longer asked if their father would be there tomorrow. They began to plan for days ahead. Birthdays, graduations, milestones they once believed he would miss. Sarah, who had cried herself to sleep every night, now allowed herself to dream again. James himself carried a quiet gratitude.
He did not speak of miracles loudly, nor did he boast about his survival. Instead, he lived each day humbly, thankful for every extra breath, every smile from his children, every moment he had been given. Life, he said, is not measured by how many days we have, but by what we do with the days we are given. His story spread far beyond the hospital walls. Local news picked it up, calling him the man who refused to die. Letters arrived from strangers, some battling their own illnesses, others simply inspired by his courage. His survival was no longer just his. It became a symbol for people everywhere who had been told their time was short. And in this moment of resolution, let me remind you of something important. If you believe in the power of hope, if you believe that stories like James deserve to be shared, then take a second to like this video and subscribe. Your support ensures that more stories of courage, resilience, and unexpected miracles can reach those who need them most. Back in the hospital, James continued to inspire everyone he met. One day, he walked into the room of a patient who had just received the same devastating diagnosis he once heard. The man was broken, silent, staring at the ceiling in despair. James sat beside him and said, "I was told I had 30 days. That was months ago. You can fight this. Do not let them write your ending." Those words, spoken not from theory, but from lived experience, carried more weight than any medical explanation. For that patient, hope was born again. And for James, it was proof that his journey had meaning beyond his own survival. The resolution of his story was not about being cured. It was about living fully, even in the face of uncertainty. It was about showing that the human spirit, when fueled by love and purpose, can overcome the darkest predictions. His doctors, though still cautious, could not hide their admiration. Some began to call him a medical mystery. Others quietly began to use a different word: miracle. James simply smiled and said, "Call it what you want. I call it life." The man who was given 1 month to live had now lived far beyond it. And while his journey was not over, his story had already left an indelible mark on everyone who crossed his path. The resolution was not just survival, it was transformation. For James, for his family, for the doctors who witnessed it, and for everyone who believed, even for a moment, that miracles are still possible. James's story was never supposed to reach this point. He had been given 30 days, 30 sunsets, 30 goodbyes. But months had passed, and he was still here. Not only here, but stronger, more alive, and more determined than anyone could have imagined. His journey had become more than survival. It had become a testament to the power of the human spirit. Yet, even as joy returned to his home, and even as his doctors marveled at the unexplainable, one truth remained. The cancer was still there. It had retreated, yes. It had weakened, yes. But it was not gone. It lingered like a shadow, silent but present, a reminder that his fight was not yet finished. James knew this. He did not live under the illusion that everything was behind him, but he chose not to live in fear of what remained. Instead, he lived in gratitude for every moment that had been given back to him. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," he said softly one evening, "but I know that today I am alive, and that is enough." His family continued to stand by his side. Sarah, once broken by grief, now held on to faith stronger than ever. Emily and Daniel, who had once prepared for a life without their father, now cherished every day they still had with him. They had learned that time was precious, but they had also learned that love could stretch every second into something infinite. For the doctors, the mystery remained unsolved. Some quietly documented his case as one of the most unusual they had ever seen. Others visited his room simply to witness the man who had redefined their understanding of life and medicine. A few, late at night, confessed to each other in hushed voices, "Maybe there are things we cannot explain." But James himself never claimed to have the answers. When asked how he survived, he would smile and say, "Because I wasn't ready to leave yet. Because I still had something to live for." As the months turned into a year, his story spread beyond the hospital, beyond his town, reaching people who had never met him but who felt changed by his journey. Letters continued to arrive. Strangers shared their own stories of survival, inspired by his. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, there is light. And yet, the question lingered. How long could this last? Was James's story a permanent rewriting of fate? Or was it only a pause in the inevitable? No one could say. Not the doctors, not his family, not even James himself. But perhaps that was the point. His story was not about knowing the ending. It was about cherishing the chapters while they lasted. It was about fighting when there was no reason to fight. It was about hope in the face of despair, love in the shadow of loss, and life in the very presence of death. One evening, as the sun set outside his window, James turned to his daughter and said, "Every day I wake up is proof that miracles are real." She smiled, holding his hand tightly, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. The story of James was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. His journey left behind a question that no one could answer completely. Was it faith? Was it medicine? Was it sheer willpower? Or was it something far greater than all of these combined? And now, that question is left for you to decide. What do you believe? Because sometimes the most powerful part of a story is not the ending, but the mystery that remains.